Your bulletins say that the scripture reading will be from Genesis 28. As Sonny mentioned, maybe a familiar passage. I was not in church last weekend. Sonny was not in the office this week. And somehow, totally separate from one another, we ended up with the same text. If we were mystics, we might. You are going to get to Genesis 28 with me. I'm not going to preach Genesis 28 as such, but I'm going to preach the idea I think that Sonny landed on last week, and then we'll circle back around to Genesis 28 at the end and sort of rehash that a little bit. As Sonny said, I'm thrilled to have my family here, my mother and father-in-law, Sandy and Steve Kaufman, my parents, Jane and Conrad, and my wife and baby girl, who is precious moments from a meltdown. So she may be exiting the sanctuary here. But, we're all together because Sandy and Steve got a timeshare down on New Smyrna Beach where we're all kind of at base camp this week, and friends and family are going to come and go, and we've been able to check in yesterday and enjoy being at the beach. It was interesting last night after a great meal sitting outside, watching the ocean and the surf and enjoying the sunset, and there was this nagging voice in the back of my head that said, "Go inside and finish the sermon." You need to go tweak it. You know, it's not 100%. And I started to think how ridiculous it is that I would leave that scenery to go inside and try and write some profound words about God. I thought to myself, why not just bring the church out here and point and say there? I cannot put that into words. And then again this morning, this is a picture, the sunrise that was just up there. The idea that I would leave that to come somewhere else to worship, something doesn't compute. It doesn't sit well with me. I want to invite us to examine the way that we see the world, the way that we think about God. What is God like? And this has everything to do with how we be the church, with how we do ministry. For me specifically, how I engage college students and young adults, but for all of us, for everyone that the church stands to serve and to love and to engage. Very early in the biblical story, in the story of the Exodus, God says, "Let them make a sanctuary for me, that I may dwell among them." And so early in the story, they make God a house, a place, a sanctuary, a dwelling, followed by 15 chapters of instructions. They make sacred garments, and then they make sacred emblems. There's a sacred meal, and then to go with the sacred emblems and garments and meals, there are sacred offerings and sacred oils. There's sacred bread, sacred symbols, sacred vessels. This word sacred in the Hebrew is kodesh. It means holy. It's the word we use when we sing holy, holy, holy. It means set apart, consecrated, differentiated from, distinct from the other. The idea that there are these things, but then there are those things. The sort of heavy sense of specialness. And in Leviticus 10, it says you're to distinguish between the holy, or the sacred, that's that same word, kodesh, the sacred and the common, between the unclean and the clean. This was a reminder to Israel. This was the explanation to them for why there is everyone. There are all people, but then there are some special people. They've got all the sacred emblems and garments and meals and oils and all of these things. So the story begins with this differentiation of physical space. There's the common everyday space, but then there's this building called the temple. There's a space other than regular common space. The one is distinguished from the other. One is clean, the other is unclean. One is common, the other is sacred. The sense that this is for everyone, but then this is just for the handful with all the sacred garments and oils and meals and symbols. They get to go to the sacred place. And so there develops the sense that there are two realms that exist. Leviticus says clearly we're supposed to distinguish between the one and the other. In the ancient world, this is the way people saw things. It was a binary existence built on this sense of zeros and ones, that this is sacred. This is common. It was black and white. What I wonder is, what does Jesus do with this reality? This is the story he comes out of, but when he comes on the scene, how does he handle it? the split between sacred and special and holy, set-apart space and the rest of space, this split between sacred occupations and vocations and calling, and then the rest of us, the pipe fitters and the lawyers, the people who get up and go earn a living. What does Jesus do with the sense that there are places where you can say certain things and you can act a certain way, but then there's another place and you only act a very specific way in that place? Does Jesus defend this understanding of reality? Does he see it differently? As you think about your life and as you travel and rub elbows with different groups of people, how do you identify with this sort of split understanding? In Matthew chapter 12, Matthew tells this story. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat them. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests of the temple profane the Sabbath and are yet guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." So this story takes place on a sacred day. This day is set apart. This is not a common day. This isn't like a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday. This is not a regular day. This is the Sabbath. And now the job of religion is to keep the split worldview intact. Religion thrives in its rules and its codes and its regulations and keeping the split preserved. And so in the story we have the Pharisees. They are the religious establishment, the gatekeepers of the sacred. They're keeping the split preserved. And at this time, they're especially keeping the split preserved between the sacred traditions of Israel and the very Roman, Hellenistic, Gentile traditions that are invading with the Roman army. And to this group of people who does little aside from read the law and study the law and try and figure out how to live the law, Jesus says, "Haven't you read the law?" We underappreciate Jesus' snarky, sarcastic sense of humor as he takes jabs at the religious establishment. "Haven't you read the law?" he says to this group of legal experts. And he concludes with an even more harsh statement. Something greater than the temple is here. Something greater than the temple is here. I don't think we can understand how profoundly challenging a statement like that is for this group of people. Their entire consciousness is shaped around the temple. This is where God is for Israel. This is where everything is happening. And Jesus has the gall to come and say, something greater than the temple? People wouldn't even have been able to conceive of the possibility that something greater than the temple existed. And Jesus is saying something greater than the temple is here. I told this story a couple weeks ago in the gathering service. The last few weeks have been some of the most exciting in Ironman distance triathlon in probably the last 20 years. About 3 weekends ago, a guy by the name of Marino van Hohenacker, which is just a phenomenal name, fun to say, a Swedish racer, he went out and not even thinking about it, broke the world record for the fastest ever Ironman distance. Now this is a 2.5-mile swim, 112-mile cycling, followed by a full marathon, 26-mile run. He went out and did this in 7 hours and 48 minutes. If I'm on target for my Ironman next summer, I'll be getting off the bike about 10 minutes after he finished the entire race. Just phenomenal what these professional athletes can do. Even more amazing is the fact that that world record had not been broken in 20 years. People didn't think it was possible. Before, Mark Allen set the record 20 years earlier at 7 hours and 50 minutes. And since then, everyone said, there's no such thing as anything greater than that. 750 is the shadow in which all of Ironman triathlon lived for the 20 years prior, and then somehow Marino van Hohenacker goes out and breaks the record And people went absolutely insane. They started saying, we've got to remeasure the course. We've got to check him for performance-enhancing drugs. There's no way he did this. This was impossible. He could not have broken the record. So finally, the Friday of the following week, they said, it stands. The course was the right length. His blood was clean. Everything stands. So he's broken the record. The next day, a guy by the name of Christian Raylert went out and broke it again. He did it 3 minutes faster than Marino. And they interviewed them side by side, and they said, Marino, how did you do it? And he said, I didn't even think about it. I didn't go out thinking I was going to break the record. But when they asked Christian Raylert, they said, well, how did you do it? And he said, for so long we've been living in the shadow of the 750 that last weekend when Marino broke the record, he told us all that something greater was possible. Jesus steps into a system that's been centuries and centuries and centuries in the making. The entire Israelite consciousness is shaped around the temple, and he says something greater than the temple is here. And it absolutely blows their minds. They can't even conceive of this. Something is happening in Jesus that is greater than the temple. In John chapter 2, he makes a statement that's equally volatile. In verse 18, he has just cleansed the temple. He's made a whip of cords and driven out the money changers. And they say, Jesus, what sign do you have to show us for doing these things? And he answers them, destroy this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Now, John, after the fact, has some perspective and says, we find out much later that Jesus is referring to death and resurrection. But at the time, for Jesus to say these words, destroy the temple, just absolutely shocking language. This is the center of their life. Everything is built around the temple for them. And so in this view of reality, there are some things that are common, blood and sweat and paycheck and sexuality, but then there's the temple, the holy, sacred space. In sacred space, you don't just tell any old joke. You tell Christian jokes. You don't listen to any old music in sacred space. You listen to Christian music. You don't just read any old books, right? You go to the Christian bookstore. You don't eat any old chicken sandwich. You go to Chick-fil-A, right? You get your Christian chicken sandwich. There's this sense that there's the sacred, and then there is the common. There are two realms, and Jesus has come and said something greater than the temple, and he said, destroy the temple. And so it's interesting because in one sense, he's associating himself with this old thing, but he's promising that a new reality is actually coming about. Somehow the death and destruction of this old thing in this old way, and the giving birth to this new thing in this new way, they are mysteriously tied up in Jesus' death and resurrection. Now, in the split worldview, the temple actually had different degrees of holiness. Within sacred space, there were like different levels. So there's the outer court of the Gentiles, and then the court of the women, and then the court of the men, and then the court of the priests, and at the very center is the Holy of Holies, where one priest gets to go in one day a year, and it's surrounded by this veil. The idea is that if God is the center of Israel's life, if God is at the center of the club, then there needs to be a velvet rope so that not just everybody gets in to see God. There needs to be some bouncers, and we'll call them priests, because not just any riffraff gets to come in to see God. But in Matthew 27:50, at the tail end of the crucifixion scene, it says, Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit, and behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This is the veil, the curtain at the center of the temple that separates the Holy of Holies from the common. Matthew is a brilliant Jewish writer, and he has a brilliant Jewish audience who would have understood the arrangement of the temple. And so when the curtain is torn, later biblical writers start to say, now with Jesus' death, people have direct relationship with God. People can go in. The curtain is torn. People can go in to God, which raises an interesting observation. People can go in. God can come out. Is this scandalous to Israel? People can go in. Has somebody actually left the door open and allowed God to go and roam about in God's good world? People through Jesus' death and resurrection have all sorts of new access to God. Not just we go into the old system, in the old sacred spaces, but God has out. The whole system changes. This is a monumental shift in the way people understood reality. It's always been this way, but now everything has changed. Sacred, common, clean, unclean, holy, and everyday, temple, but now something greater than the temple. About 10 years ago, I was in Costa Rica with a group of friends, and one of my best friends all the way through high school was a guy named Matt, and I got him to come to youth group with me from time to time, but he just didn't buy it. He didn't really want to have anything to do with religion. He didn't believe it, and yet for some reason, one day we took about a 30-minute boat ride out around a big outcropping, and we ended up in this secluded bay. You couldn't get to it by hiking in. There were no roads, and it was one of the best surf breaks. It broke over a really shallow reef. It was crystal clear water, like a swimming pool. And sitting out in the water, he looked at me and he said, okay, I guess. We're surrounded by lush mountains all around. I guess it's hard for me to believe that there is no God. Something he hadn't ever encountered in religion or youth group, and yet sitting out there in the middle of the beauty of creation, for some reason felt compelled to tell me that maybe he felt like there could be a God. I'm reading both of Lance Armstrong's biographies, which are great reads, and it's interesting when he starts to talk about faith. He has had this terrible experience with a stepfather who was a Christian deacon when he was younger, and it turns out that he was abusive to Lance and to Lance's mother. And so Lance's take on faith and organized religion and Christianity has been forever tainted. And it's phenomenal to hear him talk about his understanding of spirituality and faith, because he's convinced that he's not Christian, even though he's incredibly fond of Jesus, even though he has a chapel in his home in Girona, Spain. He doesn't think he can be a Christian because he doesn't measure up, and because his faith is experienced in the common. He experiences faith on the bike. He experiences faith with his family, with his kids, among his friends. With Jesus, this whole system comes crashing down, and something new emerges in which the holy is somehow now to be found in the midst of the common. The sacred is now to be found and understood within the everyday. The line of religion that has separated sacred and common has been erased. And so there is everything that we see, our experiences, what we do day in and day out, and just beneath the surface of those things, there is all sorts of sacred depth. This has huge implications for how we understand ministry and what it means to follow Jesus. Jesus tells a story about bringing justice to the world, about separating sheep and goats. And he says, when you gave me something to eat, and when you clothed me, and when you visited me in prison and gave me something to drink. And they said, Jesus, when did we do all these things for you? He says, when you did these to the least of these, you did these for me. And you've probably heard this sermon preached 100 times, but if we look at it from the flip side, it's interesting. Because what it tells us is that it's easy to be around people who are creative and generous and kind and loving and gracious and sacrificial and encouraging and affirming, and to say, oh, that feels good. I really felt like there was some God in that moment. That felt incredibly Jesus-y. And maybe we experience that in church from time to time, but Jesus is actually saying the opposite. He's saying that his followers are the kind of people who are finding the life of God, the sacred, in the least expected places, in the least expected people, that we're able more and more in our interactions with others to tune into the sacred in that exchange. And so it's no longer just that bothersome, needy, high-maintenance person, but somehow we have access to the living Christ in that encounter. That we ought to be growing in our ability to sense in the common and mundane and everyday the sacred nature of that interaction. Which raises an interesting question. If, to Sonny's point last week, if God lives within us, and if Jesus' understanding is that God lives everywhere, even outside the walls of the church, as scandalous as that sounds, why gather? Why do we do this every week? Why do we listen to sermons and sing songs and create programs? I would argue that the only reason we ought to ever be doing these things is to grow as a community in our sense of finding the Christ in the common, to make us more aware of the Christ in the common, to elevate our sense that God and Jesus and the sacred are right there with us in the middle of the everyday. You see, religious gatherings can either affirm this split worldview with rules and exclusive membership and regulations and building fences and judging people, or our gatherings can awaken us to the living Christ, the resurrected Jesus, the kingdom of God right in the midst of the common and ordinary. This is the job of the church staff, right? It's not to create and manufacture programs that lead you all to believe that God is only to be found here. Instead, the job of the staff is to heighten our awareness over and over and over that God is to be found everywhere, in your jobs, in your families, in your interactions with people who are easy to love, and especially with those who are most difficult to love. Our job is to interrupt and provoke and remind you that God does not live here, that God is out there. God is everywhere. If our gatherings and our teachings and our programs and our ministries ever serve to further this split worldview, to divide the universe, this idea that God is here, but God is most certainly not here, that God is for these people, but God is most certainly not for these people, if what we do ever serves to further that split, it is not Christian, no matter how many Bible verses it quotes. It is not the gospel. This has huge implications for how we do ministry in general, and certainly how I plan to engage in Grow College and Young Adult Ministry at Central. If you think about how we engage with people that we live with in this sacred and common mush pot in which we find ourselves, we tend to other people, and I'm using other as a verb. We tend to push people away or judge them or hold them at arm's length based on politics or religion or race or sexuality or culture. And what we've found, and if you just turn on the TV and turn to anything that involves politics, you can see this illustrated brilliantly. From the extreme edge of any perspective, we can paint a caricature of another person and rip it to shreds because we do not have to know that person. But if we're actually following Jesus, if we're actually growing in our awareness of the Christ in the common, it becomes harder and harder and harder for us to speak of those evil people and those stupid people and those ignorant people and those awful people, because sweeping generalizations and demonizing and dehumanizing is actually moving in the opposite direction of finding the Christ in the common. If everyone bears the image of God, if everyone breathes the divine breath, if everyone bears the divine spark, who are we to take what is sacred and kick it around and knock it around, to desecrate it, to rob it of its sacred nature? Take college students and young adults, for example. This is called Generation IY. Very interesting group of people. This is sort of a Facebook tech generation. Whatever assumptions we may or may not have made about this age stage as a cultural phenomenon or as a people group, whatever judgments we may have made about their worldview, their obsession with online identity, their relationship to technology and the way that that shapes their theology and their values, for us to follow Jesus means that we check those things at the door, that we drop those things, that we let them go, and we understand that college students and young adults are people. They're human. They're loved by God. And they are the church, whether or not they do religion on our terms. And we will encounter college students and young adults whose faith seems so common to us that it's almost foreign. It will be in those moments that we will figure out whether or not we succeed in serving college students and young adults as a church. So this impacts the way we see others, but what about how we see ourselves? The scriptures tell us that we are a royal priesthood, which means we don't need a priest to take us in to the holy place. If you've got a garden, if you've got a car, if you can make it out to the beach, you've got a cubicle or a sofa or a golf course or a boat. For me, it's a bike and a wide open road. Our spirituality can be done anywhere, at any time. We have direct access to God. No priest necessary. This includes the way that we invite others into this faith as well. We invite others to encounter God directly. If we find ourselves standing between others and their relationship with God, we've taken on this role of priest again, wrongly. And here we are back at Genesis 28. Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of that place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you forever wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised. Then Jacob awoke from the sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. So he has this epic dream. I don't know about how you all dream, but I tend to dream about food, surfing, sometimes about cycling. I don't have epic dreams like this. Sounds to me a little bit like a bad flashback. Jacob has this, what seems like a crazy dream, and he wakes up and says, Surely God was in this place all along, and I was simply unaware of it. What does it mean for us to follow Jesus, to be disciples, to pursue the way of God? What is it into which we're inviting college students and young adults and everyone to whom Central ministers? What's the definition of faith? What if it actually is this easy? What if it's waking up and continuing to wake up to the realization that God has been here all along, and maybe it was us who simply were not aware of it? It's easy to see life as common, and we leave the common once a week and go to church and do the important things. There are 6 days where we take out the trash and go to the doctor and do laundry and pay taxes and go on vacation. We feed the dog and love our families and do our chores and go to work and go to class and go to sleep. But then one day a week we come leaving the common to engage the important, meaningful things. This is not the way Jacob sees the world, and I would argue this is not the way that Jesus sees the world. One of the highest values of college students and young adults is authenticity. We've got to be relentlessly honest as a congregation about the truth that when we come together, whether in our worship or our programs, we are not coming here to find God. We're coming here to wake up and to seek God intentionally and to listen and learn together how to find God everywhere else. There's a huge difference, and once we've seen this, we can't unsee it. It makes our faith scandalously open, and it makes it incredibly good news. May we grow in our sense of awareness and understanding that whatever times and gatherings and institutions and programs and religion and theology in which we have tried to confine God simply cannot contain the life-giving, buoyant, thrilling, captivating message and power of the resurrected Jesus. May our worship and study, our programs and our service to the community become for Central a sort of rhythm of waking up and remembering and celebrating that what we do together is live and invite others to live in light of the Christ in the common. Amen. Our hymn of commitment today, we'll get ready to sing, is number 457, and we want to invite you, if you've been around religion a long time but never heard Jesus presented in such an open way, and you're thinking that maybe this is the time that you want to begin to follow that, we invite you to do that. You can come up, we'll be up here to speak with you about that. Or maybe you've been looking for a community like this with whom to journey on this walk of faith, and we invite you to do that as well, to come and join Central Baptist. If you will, let's stand and sing our hymn of commitment.